Toleration sounds like something easy, doesn't it? It sounds like something then within a certain context that everybody would say yes, they would be tolerant. But actually it's deeply difficult, isn't it?
Oh, very deeply difficult. Most people would say they believe in tolerance. And Americans in particular, like my American students, think they believe in it as an absolute value. Anyone who suggests that tolerance should have some limits is someone, they think it's disturbing. And so most people would endorse it as a general principle. But actually, you can endorse it as a general principle, but whether you're going to practice it is another matter. And the stronger you endorse it as a general principle, the more likely you are to practice it. But nonetheless, when you're actually confronted with difference, when you actually have Nazis demanding freedom of speech and marching down your street, or you have people living next door who are loud and noisy in your view, dressing in odd clothes, and
all of the arguments about the hijab and
yes, or you see women being culturally encased in your view in a way of life that you think is inconsistent with the principles of your society. It's very, very different, a very, very different matter, and this general principle in which you may believe, it's not so clear how it applies to the case. And I'm not suggesting that in all these cases the principle should just be applied and you ought to tolerate everything. Perhaps you shouldn't. But the message is that, I think the message of Walter's book and the message of the course I teach is that unlike other virtues, with tolerance, there are very few principles, universal principles, you can just take and apply in different societies and different cases. What you need to do to decide whether something is tolerable or intolerable, and some things are intolerable. That's why we have the word. Some things are intolerable. But to know what those things are and should properly be treated as intolerable, you need to think about it, and you need to discuss it, and you need to have good arguments. You can't just go with your gut reaction. If you go with your gut reaction, you're going to be going with these primitive evolutionary reactions that we're probably programmed to go with, and they're very destructive. And so you have to think about it, and you should not interfere with someone else's. This was John Locke's argument, and it's still true today. You should not interfere with someone else's way of life, their religion, their beliefs, or anything like that, unless you have very good reasons to do so. They should be able to live their life just as you live your life the way they want to. Now, there may be cases where you do have very good reasons to do so, to interfere and demand that they act differently.
Give me an example of such an occasion
where
you would have to intervene, where you would have to be intolerant in order to be tolerant.
Well, how about honor killings? And honor killings in families, where it is a tradition of the family that if the daughter doesn't behave in the way the family thinks that she ought to behave, that's a modest, proper way that's consistent with their religious faith, the proper solution for that is that besmirches the family's honor, and the proper solution is to kill her. Well, in any liberal democratic society, that's not an acceptable solution. It is an absolutely unacceptable solution, and not just because it's murder. It's absolutely unacceptable. And that goes back to Waltzer's question about if you're tolerating groups versus tolerating individuals. And there's a tension between the two. So if you tolerate a group like this that has that practice, you can tolerate the group and its practices and its way of life. But look what you're doing to the individuals within the group. The group is being intolerant to some of its individuals in a terrible way. And so a liberal democratic society needs to say, I believe, that we will tolerate groups. We all do have to live together and live with our differences, but there are limits to the degree to which we're going to tolerate them. And in a liberal democratic society, one of those limits has to do with our commitment to protecting the freedom and liberty of individual citizens. And once that freedom and liberty is getting trod upon, then it's probably justifiable to intervene. But even that sounds like a general principle. Even that, most people would apply that principle differently in different cases. And you have to get into the case, and you have to analyze the case.
Give me another case where, again, the nuance is important.
In Chapel Hill, where I teach, a communitarian political philosopher was visiting one weekend, giving some talks. And I went out to dinner with him and with his host, who was also a communitarian political philosopher. Now, communitarian political philosophers are people who are liberal Democrats, but they also believe very strongly in community. And the previous week, there had been a news article about something that had happened in Israel. And it had happened in the ultra-Orthodox Haredi communities, which are located, in particular, these communities are located in a certain area in Israel that's served by a private bus service with a partial public subsidy. But it's mainly private, and it is the only way of getting, the only means of public transportation among these communities. So a visiting American woman who was Jewish, who had been quite Orthodox, but had recently become less Orthodox and more Reform, was visiting Israel. And she's from New York. And that's, I think, relevant to the story that she's from New York, relevant to the case. And she took the bus. And she got on the bus, and she was told that she had to go to the back of the bus. And she asked why, and they said because she's a woman. And the rules in our Haredi communities are you ride in the back of the bus, women ride in the back of the bus. And she said, well, she said, I think this woman's going to ride in the front of the bus. And she sat down in one of the seats in the front of the bus. At the next stop, a large Haredi man got on the bus and saw her, came over to her and started shouting at her, started threatening her, really, overbearing, standing over her, screaming at her. The next stop, another man got on, and they both engaged in the same kind of threatening, screaming behavior, telling her to get to the back of the bus. This is the New York part of the story, she stood up at that point, put her finger up in front of their faces and said, you show me in Jewish law where women are required to ride in the back of the bus. And until you can do so, get out of my face.
Yeah.
And she got off the bus at the next stop, and she sued the bus company, and she sued the state of Israel for allowing them to do this and for providing a little bit of a subsidy. And so we talked about this at dinner, the two communitarian political philosophers and me. And to my astonishment, both of them thought she should have gone to the back of the bus. And one of them was Jewish. And they thought this because they felt that it was important to preserve the Haredi communities. And when you preserve any community, you're going to preserve some unpleasant practices. Now, it's a question, how unpleasant are you going to tolerate? How much unpleasantness are you going to tolerate? What degrees of unpleasantness are you going to tolerate? But both of them found that degree of unpleasantness acceptable. And I didn't. And my only regret was I wasn't on the bus with her and I couldn't stand up with her and say some things about what I thought about how she was being treated. But these two colleagues are very smart and they have very good reasons, very good arguments. And we talk. So there's a case where intelligent, reasonable people could disagree, I suppose. And it's a case where you're pitting community against the individual, the value of community versus the value of the individual. And where you're going to come out on that has something to do with the degree to which you value communities or value individual freedom and liberty and autonomy.
And what do your students say about toleration? How do they react to this central set of issues?
Well, this generation of American students are, I don't know, telling in France, they just don't understand the French, the idea that women should be prevented from wearing headscarves or religious symbols in public places. They just think all of this is nonsense. And so they're really quite extreme in their views when they come into the class. And one of the things they learn in the class, actually, is that tolerance is not an absolute value, and that there are some things that are intolerable, maybe more things than they thought were intolerable. And However, they need to be very careful about what they choose to go about pushing people about on and telling people they have to change this, that, and the other thing. And they need to have very, very good reasons before they do that. But so some things are intolerable. And one of the things that amuses them about the course is they discover by the end of the course, through all our discussions, that actually I'm less tolerant than most of them. I find more things intolerable than most of them do, and they find it very amusing that here I am teaching a course in the politics of tolerance, but actually...
And what are you intolerant of?
What am I intolerant of? Well, I don't like people playing loud music in cars with the windows open going down the streets. I don't like incivility. I was in a restaurant in the States, and at the next table there was a group of evangelical Christians, and they all joined hands in a circle and started praying very loudly, very loudly. And it was a small room in this restaurant, and I don't know, there must have been 10 or 12 other tables, and they were really intrusive upon everybody else. And I expected it to end very quickly, but it didn't. It went on and on and on. You know, I could give reasons why I think it was intolerable, and I got up to go and ask them to stop. But at that point, they did stop, so I didn't have to ask them to, act contrary to their religious practices.
You described two goals in setting up the course, one normative and the other empirical. What did you mean by that?
Well, the first half of the course deals with the concept of tolerance, really, and deals with these kinds of cases and situations. It's a normative perspective. When should you tolerate? When shouldn't you tolerate? An understanding of the concept and how to apply the concept. So that's the normative part of the course. It begins with John Locke and John Stuart Mill, and it works through Michael Walzer's book and another book on identity by a political philosopher, Amy Gutman, and it works through a lot of cases to try and give students a feeling for identifying cases of intolerance, seeing them for what they are, and then making decisions about them on the basis of their own principles, their own beliefs about maybe the individual versus the community, or other principles that they think should or shouldn't be applied. Then the second half of the course, the empirical part of the course, deals with theories that are used to explain cases of intolerance. If you have a great deal of intolerance towards Muslims in the Netherlands, for instance, how do you explain that? Well, how do you explain how it rises and falls, and so on, and how it changes over time? And there are interesting social science explanations. The principal one is something called social identity theory in social psychology. And we look at a lot of those explanations, and some explanations that focus more on macro historical concepts, and that have explanations that focus on variables like how diverse the society is to begin with, how different the groups are, whether there's small differences, large differences, and so on, whether you're dealing with times of prosperity or economic downturns. That has a lot to do with tolerance and intolerance too. There are some very famous and very interesting articles that were written about hangings in the American South that correlated, and the data are excellent, and the methodology has been done 2 or 3 times over, and it's superb, that correlate the incidence of hanging black Americans by white Americans in the American South with rises and falls in the price of cotton. In other words, with rises and falls in prosperity in the society. And we're seeing a lot of intolerance in Europe these days with anti-immigrant parties and neo-Nazi parties and so on, political parties. And this is exacerbated by the current economic situation. I'm afraid we're going to see more of it.